What if I told you that some of America's greatest warriors never fired a single bullet in combat? That the men who helped win World War II wielded paintbrushes instead of rifles, theater props instead of tanks, and sound effects instead of artillery? In the shadow of Normandy's beaches and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a peculiar battalion operated under such strict secrecy that even generals commanding adjacent units had no idea they existed. They were artists, designers, actors, and sound engineers drafted into the United States Army's most classified deception unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known today as the Ghost Army. This wasn't Hollywood fantasy or military folklore. This was tactical deception elevated to an art form, where inflatable Sherman tanks fooled Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots, where recorded sound effects of mechanized divisions convinced German intelligence officers that entire army corps occupied positions that were, in reality, completely empty. These men painted fake unit insignia on their shoulders, drove through French villages pretending to be generals they'd never met, and constructed elaborate theatrical sets that transformed quiet sectors into apparent staging grounds for massive offensives. The German Wehrmacht, with all its vaunted military intelligence apparatus, found itself shooting at shadows, repositioning divisions to counter threats that existed only on canvas and in carefully orchestrated sound. The Ghost Army's story remained classified for nearly 50 years after the war ended. When veterans finally gained permission to speak about their service, the world discovered that approximately 1,100 men had conducted 20 major tactical deceptions across Europe, operations that military historians now credit with saving an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. They operated in the wake of genuine combat units, creating the illusion that battle-hardened divisions remained in position even as those forces moved to strike elsewhere. They made the invisible visible and the visible invisible, transforming the battlefield into a stage where perception mattered more than reality. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of World War II's most extraordinary units, men who fought with creativity rather than conventional weapons, who understood that in modern warfare, the enemy's mind could be as valuable a target as his body. This is the story of what happens when you give artists the mission to deceive, when you train designers to think like generals, and when you ask theater professionals to perform for an audience that will kill them if they discover the truth. This is the story of the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army officially activated on January 20th, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, though its conceptual origins reached back to the deserts of North Africa, where British deception units had successfully fooled Rommel's Afrika Korps. The unit comprised four principal elements: the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, who specialized in visual deception; the 32nd Signal Service Company Special, responsible for sonic deception; the Signal Company Special, which handled radio deception; and the 406th Combat Engineers, who provided security and performed actual construction work to enhance the illusions. What made this unit unprecedented wasn't merely its mission, but its personnel. The Army had deliberately recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, design firms, and entertainment industries. Men who had been creating window displays for department stores suddenly found themselves designing fake supply dumps. Fashion illustrators became experts in camouflage patterns. Sound engineers who had worked in radio studios were now recording and playing back the mechanical symphony of warfare. The unit included future luminaries like fashion designer Bill Blass, photographer Art Kane, and painter Ellsworth Kelly. These weren't soldiers who happened to have artistic hobbies. These were professional artists temporarily inhabiting military uniforms. The moment that would define the Ghost Army's entire operational philosophy occurred during their training at Camp Forest, when Commanding Officer Colonel Harry Reeder gathered the men and explained their actual mission. Unlike virtually every other military unit, they would measure success not by ground taken or enemies killed, but by whether they convinced German intelligence that American forces existed where they did not. Every operation would be a performance, every soldier an actor, every piece of equipment a stage prop. The contradiction was immediate and profound. They were soldiers trained not to fight, but to pretend to fight. Warriors whose greatest weapon was their ability to lie convincingly under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The Ghost Army shipped to England in May 1944, arriving just as the largest amphibious invasion in history entered its final planning stages. While they wouldn't participate in the D-Day landings themselves, their training intensified. as Allied commanders began to grasp the unit's potential. The fundamental challenge was this: modern warfare had become increasingly dependent on intelligence gathering. Both sides employed reconnaissance aircraft, intercepted radio communications, interrogated prisoners, and analyzed countless data points to determine enemy positions and intentions. The Ghost Army's mission was to feed false information into this intelligence machine, to make the enemy see what wasn't there and overlook what was. Consider the scale of what they attempted. A genuine armored division in World War II comprised approximately 10,000 to 15,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, extensive radio networks, and massive supply operations. The Ghost Army would simulate this with roughly 100 men, a few dozen inflatable tanks and vehicles, portable speakers, and carefully scripted radio transmissions. They would create an illusion so convincing that German commanders would commit real divisions to counter it, that Luftwaffe pilots returning from reconnaissance missions would report seeing what the Ghost Army wanted them to see, that Wehrmacht intelligence officers analyzing radio intercepts would conclude that American forces occupied positions they had never actually entered. The first test came in mid-June 1944, shortly after the Normandy invasion, when the Ghost Army staged Operation Elephant near the Normandy beachhead. Their mission: make the Germans believe that a massive buildup of American forces was occurring in a sector where Allied commanders actually planned no significant action. For this operation, they deployed their full arsenal of deception techniques simultaneously for the first time in actual combat conditions. The visual deception team inflated rubber tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, carefully positioning them to create believable military encampments. These weren't crude props. Each inflatable tank required a compressor and approximately 15 minutes to fully inflate, and once deployed, soldiers had to continuously maintain and adjust them to account for wind, weather, and the deflation that occurred naturally over time. The inflatables came from companies that normally manufactured rubber products for civilian use, adapted through extensive testing to withstand field conditions. From ground level, an experienced observer could potentially identify them as fakes, but from the air, the perspective of German reconnaissance aircraft, they were indistinguishable from genuine equipment. The sonic deception element positioned their speakers, which they'd nicknamed heaters, along the front lines. These speakers, mounted in half-tracks, could project recorded sounds up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. The Ghost Army had compiled an audio library of warfare: tanks moving, troops marching, equipment being loaded and unloaded, all recorded at actual military bases, and now played back in carefully sequenced programs designed to simulate the acoustic signature of a division preparing for combat operations. The sound engineers had to account for terrain, weather conditions, and the acoustic properties of different environments. What worked in an open field might sound completely unconvincing in a forest. Meanwhile, the radio deception teams began transmitting carefully crafted messages using proper military protocols and communication procedures. They replicated the communication patterns of genuine units, sending routine administrative messages, supply requests, and tactical updates that German signals intelligence would intercept and analyze. Each fake unit had to maintain consistent communication patterns over days or weeks. Sudden silence would alert enemy intelligence that something had changed, just as unusual radio traffic would. The intriguing provocation that defined Operation Elephant's success came 3 days into the operation, when Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed the fake positions. German intelligence interpreted the photos as confirmation of a major American buildup, and Wehrmacht commanders repositioned artillery and reserve units to counter the perceived threat. The Ghost Army had successfully drawn enemy attention and resources toward empty positions, exactly as intended. But this initial success raised a disturbing question that would haunt the unit throughout the war. If they succeeded too well, if they convinced the Germans that a major force occupied their fake positions, would the Wehrmacht attack them? The Ghost Army carried standard infantry weapons for self-defense, but 1 to 100 lightly armed soldiers would be massacred if a German division discovered the deception and struck in force. This tension between the requirement to create convincing deceptions and the vulnerability inherent in their mission shaped everything the Ghost Army did. They operated closest to enemy lines of almost any American unit, often within artillery range, sometimes within small arms range. They couldn't simply pack up and retreat if discovered. because abandoning their positions prematurely would compromise the deception. Yet they also couldn't defend themselves effectively if attacked in strength. Every operation balanced on a knife's edge between success and catastrophe. The landscape of Europe itself became their stage. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the rolling hills of Luxembourg, from the forests of the Ardennes to the plains approaching the Rhine, the Ghost Army adapted their techniques to match the terrain. In open country, they could deploy larger numbers of dummy vehicles visible from great distances. In forests, they relied more heavily on sonic deception because visual observation was limited. Near rivers, they created fake pontoon bridges and crossing sites. In towns, they staged elaborate theatrical performances where soldiers impersonated officers from units that weren't actually present. The weather became both obstacle and opportunity. Rain could deflate their rubber equipment or make it sag unnaturally, but it also grounded German reconnaissance aircraft, giving them time to position equipment without aerial observation. Snow could reveal that their dummy tanks weren't actually moving, but it could also make their positions look more authentic by accumulating on equipment in realistic patterns. Wind could tear inflatable equipment from its moorings, but could also carry their sonic deceptions further than anticipated, potentially deceiving enemy units they hadn't even known were listening. The Ghost Army's formation emerged from hard lessons learned through blood and failure. In the early years of World War II, Allied forces had suffered devastating losses, partly because German intelligence had proven remarkably effective at determining Allied intentions and dispositions. From the disaster at Dieppe to setbacks in North Africa, Allied commanders repeatedly found their plans anticipated and countered by Wehrmacht forces who seemed to know exactly where and when attacks would occur. The British had begun experimenting with deception operations, most notably under the direction of Colonel Dudley Clark in the Mediterranean theatre, where inflatable tanks and dummy installations had contributed to Montgomery's victory at El Alamein by convincing Rommel that the main British attack would come from a different direction than it actually did. American military planners, initially skeptical of deception warfare as somehow unsporting or contrary to American directness, gradually recognized that modern industrial warfare required every possible advantage. The Ghost Army represented the American adoption and expansion of British deception concepts, infused with characteristically American approaches to problem solving. If deception could help win the war faster, with fewer casualties, then deception would be employed on an unprecedented scale, with whatever resources and personnel could make it effective. The recruitment process deliberately sought individuals whose civilian expertise matched the mission requirements. Bill Blass, who would become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers after the war, enlisted as a private and found himself assigned to the Ghost Army based on his design background. He later recalled the surreal experience of being interviewed not about his physical fitness or marksmanship, but about his understanding of color theory, perspective, and visual composition. Ellsworth Kelly, whose abstract expressionist paintings would revolutionize post-war American art, spent his Ghost Army service creating camouflage patterns and painting fake insignia. Art Kane, whose photography would define visual culture in the 1950s and 1960s, used his technical understanding of light and shadow to make inflatable equipment appear genuine in reconnaissance photographs. The unit also included actors from Broadway, illustrators from Madison Avenue advertising agencies, set designers from Hollywood studios, and sound engineers from radio networks. Many had volunteered for military service, expecting to fight in conventional infantry or armored units. Instead, they found themselves in a unit that valued creativity over conformity, where superior officers encouraged questioning and innovation rather than demanding, unthinking obedience. This created internal conflicts within the unit. Traditional Army NCOs struggled to impose standard military discipline on men who viewed regulations as suggestions rather than commands, while the artists sometimes chafed at the military hierarchy and procedural requirements. One formative experience occurred during training when a group of Ghost Army soldiers, practicing their cover stories in a local Tennessee town, got drunk at a bar and nearly compromised the unit's classified mission by boasting about their unusual assignment. Colonel Reeder responded not with conventional military punishment, but with a theater-style dress rehearsal, forcing the entire unit to practice their cover identities repeatedly until maintaining the deception became automatic, even under stress or impairment. This approach treating their mission as performance art requiring rehearsal and refinement, characterized the Ghost Army's training throughout their preparation period. The contradictions inherent in their mission became apparent during amphibious landing rehearsals. Unlike infantry practicing beach assaults or tankers rehearsing armored maneuvers, the Ghost Army rehearsed unpacking inflatable equipment, coordinating visual and sonic deceptions, and maintaining false radio traffic. They practiced working at night, because most deception operations would occur under cover of darkness. They had to position equipment after German reconnaissance flights ended and before dawn revealed their positions. They learned to work silently because sound carried across battlefields in ways that could betray their presence. They developed techniques for quickly repairing damaged inflatables, maintaining generators and sound equipment under field conditions, and establishing radio networks that mimicked genuine military communications. The Atlantic crossing brought these contradictions into sharp relief. The Ghost Army shipped aboard conventional military transports, surrounded by genuine combat units heading to fight in France. Those conventional soldiers viewed the Ghost Army with suspicion. Here was a unit that seemingly did nothing, that trained in activities bearing no resemblance to warfare, whose members included men who by traditional military standards seemed completely unsuited for combat service. The Ghost Army couldn't explain their actual mission because of security restrictions, so they endured mockery and suspicion, accusations of cowardice, or seeking safe rear area assignments. Some Ghost Army members responded with the dark humor that would characterize their service. They were going to France not to fight Germans, but to perform for them, and if they failed to convince their audience, they wouldn't receive bad reviews, they'd be killed. Upon arriving in England, the Ghost Army established operations at multiple locations, continuing their training while Allied planners finalized invasion preparations. They studied German reconnaissance patterns, learning what German pilots looked for and how German photo interpreters analyzed intelligence imagery. They examined genuine Allied unit deployments to understand how real divisions organized their encampments, positioned equipment, and conducted daily operations. The goal was to create deception so thoroughly realistic that even if German agents somehow infiltrated Allied lines and directly observed Ghost Army positions, they would see nothing to suggest these weren't genuine military installations. The challenge of maintaining operational security while deployed in England created additional contradictions. The Ghost Army operated openly on British military bases, inflating dummy tanks in full view of British personnel who hadn't been briefed on the unit's mission. Local civilians near their training areas could see the inflatable equipment, creating potential security breaches. The solution involved creating multiple layers of misdirection. The Ghost Army let it be known that they were developing new camouflage techniques, which was true but incomplete. They suggested their rubber equipment was experimental protective gear or alternative materials for genuine military hardware. They became experts not only at deceiving the enemy, but at managing the security concerns created by practicing deception while surrounded by friendly forces who couldn't know what they were actually doing. The psychological preparation proved as important as the technical training. These men had to internalize that their lives depended on their ability to maintain deceptions under extreme stress. Unlike conventional soldiers who could fight back when attacked, Ghost Army members would have only moments to escape if their deceptions were discovered and enemy forces attacked in strength. They trained in rapid evacuation procedures, practiced abandoning positions quickly while leaving minimal evidence of what they'd actually been doing. They learned to sleep lightly, always aware that German artillery could target their positions at any moment, that enemy patrols might probe their lines, seeking to capture prisoners who could be interrogated about unit dispositions. This constant tension created a unique psychology within the unit. They developed gallows humor about their situation, joking that they were the only American soldiers who hoped the enemy would ignore them completely. They created elaborate pranks and practical jokes, partly as stress relief, but also as a way of maintaining the mental flexibility their mission required. If you could convince your fellow soldiers that a completely absurd story was true, you were developing the skills needed to convince German intelligence that an inflatable tank was real. The first casualties the Ghost Army suffered came not from combat, but from accidents during training. Men were injured while inflating equipment in high winds. Others suffered electrical shocks from the generators and sound equipment. Some were hurt in vehicle accidents during nighttime operations. These losses reminded everyone that even though they wouldn't be fighting conventionally, their mission carried real dangers. Equipment malfunctions in combat zones would be fatal. Mistakes in positioning could draw actual artillery fire. Failures in maintaining cover stories could result in capture and execution as spies rather than treatment as prisoners of war. As D-Day approached, the Ghost Army's training reached its culmination. They had become experts in their peculiar specialty, capable of deploying complex deceptions quickly and maintaining them for extended periods. They understood German intelligence methods, knew what enemy observers would look for, had internalized the countless details that separated convincing illusions from obvious fakes. They were as ready as training could make them for the reality of operating in combat zones where the enemy was actively trying to kill them and where a single mistake could doom not just themselves, but the actual combat units whose movements their deceptions were designed to conceal. The unit's organizational structure reflected their unusual mission. Traditional military hierarchies gave way to more collaborative arrangements, where technical experts often had more operational authority than their ranks would normally grant. A private with expertise in sound engineering might override a sergeant's decision about speaker placement. A corporal with artistic training might correct an officer's ideas about camouflage patterns. This inversion of normal military authority sometimes created friction, but it also enabled the creativity and technical excellence their mission required. Training exercises became increasingly sophisticated as D-Day approached. The Ghost Army practiced complete deception operations lasting multiple days, coordinating visual, sonic, and radio elements, while genuine military units observed and critiqued their work. They learned from each exercise, refining techniques based on what worked and what didn't. They discovered that perfectly uniform arrangements of equipment looked fake. Real military units deployed with more randomness, more variation in spacing and positioning. They learned that sonic deceptions had to include mistakes and irregularities to seem authentic. Perfect mechanical precision made recordings obvious. The Ghost Army also trained in counterintelligence techniques, learning how to identify and neutralize potential security breaches. They practiced spotting enemy agents, studied techniques for maintaining cover stories under interrogation, developed procedures for securing their equipment and operational plans from enemy observation. They understood that they were engaged in a form of warfare where information security could mean the difference between life and death. The central concept that defined Ghost Army operations was what military theorists call information warfare, the recognition that controlling what the enemy perceives and believes can be as important as controlling physical terrain or destroying enemy forces. This represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. For millennia, warfare had been primarily physical. Armies fought for control of territory, cities, and resources through direct application of violence. The Ghost Army embodied a different approach. They fought for control of the enemy's decision-making process by manipulating the information upon which those decisions were based. Consider how this challenged traditional military values. American military culture particularly emphasized courage, physical toughness, and direct confrontation. The archetypal American warrior charged enemy positions, stood his ground under fire, demonstrated valor through visible action. The Ghost Army did none of these things. They hid, they deceived, they operated through misdirection and trickery. Some conventional officers viewed this as fundamentally un-American, as warfare by subterfuge rather than honest combat. Yet the Ghost Army's defenders argued they were actually embodying a deeper form of courage, the willingness to place themselves in extreme danger, not to kill the enemy, but to deceive him, knowing that if the deception failed, they had limited capacity to defend themselves. The Ghost Army also exemplified what we might call asymmetric creativity, using unconventional resources and approaches to counter enemy strengths. The Wehrmacht possessed advantages in numerous areas. More experienced units, superior defensive positions, interior lines of communication in occupied France. The Allies couldn't simply overwhelm these advantages through brute force without suffering catastrophic casualties. The Ghost Army offered a different approach. Make the Germans defend everywhere by threatening nowhere in particular. Force enemy commanders to disperse their limited reserves by creating false threats. Disrupt the German decision-making cycle by feeding their intelligence apparatus false information they couldn't easily distinguish from genuine intelligence. This concept of asymmetric creativity manifested in countless operational details. When the Ghost Army needed to simulate radio traffic from a tank battalion, they didn't simply broadcast random military messages. They studied how real tank battalions communicated, learned the personalities and communication styles of actual radio operators, understood the daily rhythms of military radio traffic, more transmissions during operations, routine administrative messages during quiet periods, specific types of messages before attacks. They then replicated these patterns so precisely that German signals intelligence analysts listening to Ghost Army transmissions heard exactly what they expected to hear from a genuine American armored unit. The visual deception work embodied similar principles. Creating a convincing fake tank required understanding not just what a tank looked like, but how tanks existed in operational environments. Real tanks leaked oil, left distinctive track marks, required maintenance, accumulated mud and dirt. The Ghost Army's dummy tanks included painted-on mud splatter, fake oil stains, simulated wear patterns on the rubber treads. They positioned inflatable tanks with the same spacing and tactical arrangements as genuine armored units. They even created fake tank tracks, using specially designed rollers pulled behind vehicles, ensuring that German agents examining the ground would find evidence consistent with heavy armored vehicles having occupied the positions. The sonic deception element took this even further into the realm of perceptual manipulation. The Ghost Army's sound library included not just recordings of tanks moving, but the complete acoustic environment of military operations, the distinctive sounds of different vehicle types, the clank of treads on different surfaces, the rumble of diesel engines idling versus moving, the characteristic noises of military units preparing for combat. They understood that human perception works through patterns. German soldiers listening to sounds from Allied positions weren't analyzing individual audio components, but unconsciously synthesizing the complete acoustic picture into an understanding of what was happening. If that complete picture matched German soldiers' expectations and experience of how American units sounded, they would accept it as genuine. This deep understanding of perception and cognition set the Ghost Army apart from earlier deception efforts. They weren't simply creating false targets for the enemy to shoot at, they were crafting complete sensory environments that would trigger specific interpretations in enemy minds. They understood that people see what they expect to see, hear what they expect to hear, and that military intelligence analysts under pressure to provide timely information to commanders would often unconsciously confirm their own expectations rather than rigorously questioning anomalous data. The Ghost Army also embodied what we might call collaborative improvisation, the ability to rapidly adapt plans to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining coordination across multiple deception elements. Unlike conventional military operations that followed detailed plans prepared well in advance, Ghost Army operations required constant adjustment. If weather conditions changed, sound propagation would change, requiring different speaker positions and volume levels. If German reconnaissance patterns shifted, visual deception layouts had to be modified. If radio intercepts suggested German intelligence suspected deception, the radio script had to be adjusted to address those suspicions without confirming them. This required trust and initiative at every level of the organization. Junior enlisted men had to make judgment calls about technical details that could compromise entire operations. Officers had to trust that specialists would solve problems creatively rather than simply following prescribed procedures. The entire unit had to maintain tight coordination. Visual, sonic, and radio deceptions all had to tell the same story simultaneously, because inconsistencies would alert German intelligence that something was wrong. Perhaps most profoundly, the Ghost Army challenged conventional military thinking about what constituted military effectiveness. Traditional metrics, enemy casualties inflicted, ground captured, battles won, didn't apply to their operations. Success meant the enemy did nothing, attacked somewhere else, held forces in reserve that could have been committed decisively at a critical point. How do you measure victories that manifest as enemy mistakes you convince them to make? How do you evaluate contributions when your greatest achievements are things that didn't happen because the enemy made decisions based on false information you provided? The psychological warfare dimension of Ghost Army operations extended beyond mere tactical deception. They were engaged in what modern theorists would call cognitive warfare, attacking the enemy's ability to understand reality accurately. Every successful deception didn't just cause German forces to make a tactical mistake, it degraded the overall reliability of German intelligence. If American divisions could appear where they weren't, If massive buildups could be faked convincingly, then German commanders had to question all intelligence, couldn't be certain about any American positions, had to hedge against possibilities rather than responding decisively to certainties. This cumulative effect multiplied the Ghost Army's impact far beyond individual operations. By September 1944, German intelligence officers had become increasingly paranoid about American deception operations. They suspected illusions everywhere, which meant they sometimes dismissed genuine intelligence as potential deception. The Ghost Army had successfully poisoned the well. German intelligence couldn't trust its own information-gathering methods because those methods had been repeatedly fooled. This created exactly the kind of decision-making paralysis the Ghost Army sought to induce. Enemy commanders who couldn't act decisively because they couldn't determine what was real. The technical innovations the Ghost Army developed would influence military operations for decades. Their inflatable tanks were crude by modern standards, but they pioneered the use of decoy equipment that would become increasingly sophisticated in subsequent conflicts. Their sonic deception techniques presaged modern audio countermeasures and acoustic spoofing. Their radio deception laid groundwork for electronic warfare capabilities that now dominate modern battlefields. Most importantly, they demonstrated that systematic, well-planned deception integrated into conventional military operations could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the resources invested. The Ghost Army's approach to their mission also embodied a uniquely American pragmatism about warfare. European military traditions often emphasized martial honor, aristocratic codes of conduct, and the romance of combat. The Ghost Army rejected all that. They approached warfare as a problem to be solved, using whatever tools worked best, without concern for whether their methods fit traditional notions of military propriety. This pragmatic approach, judging methods by results rather than traditions, would become increasingly characteristic of American military thinking in subsequent decades. The intersection of art and warfare in the Ghost Army's operations raised fascinating questions about the nature of both. What did it mean for artists to use their creative skills not to inspire or beautify, but to deceive and confuse? The Ghost Army's members grappled with this tension throughout their service. They were using artistic techniques, visual composition, color theory, acoustic design, performance, in service of deception and ultimately violence. Some found this troubling. Others viewed it as simply another application of their skills. But all recognized they were engaged in something unprecedented, the systematic weaponization of artistic creativity. The Ghost Army developed sophisticated solutions to the fundamental challenge of tactical deception, creating illusions that would withstand multiple forms of enemy intelligence gathering simultaneously. Their approach integrated visual, sonic, and electronic deception into coordinated operations that addressed every method German intelligence used to assess Allied dispositions and intentions. Operation Wehrmacht, conducted in March 1945, exemplified their evolved methodology. The mission required the Ghost Army to simulate 2 full divisions, approximately 30,000 men and hundreds of vehicles, while the actual units moved north to cross the Rhine River near Wesel. This was the most ambitious deception the unit had attempted, replacing not just 1 division, but 2, in an active combat zone. While German forces maintained close observation of Allied positions, the visual deception began with terrain analysis. The Ghost Army's officers studied the actual positions held by the genuine divisions, identifying key locations visible from German observation posts and likely photographic reconnaissance flight paths. They then positioned inflatable equipment to create the impression of 2 divisions remaining in place. This required approximately 600 pieces of dummy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, jeeps, positioned across multiple square miles of territory. Each position had to account for tactical logic. Artillery pieces positioned where they could plausibly fire on German positions, tanks deployed in locations suitable for armored operations, supply dumps placed near road networks. The teams worked primarily at night, inflating and positioning equipment after darkness fell, then camouflaging positions before dawn. This work was physically exhausting and technically demanding. Inflatable tanks weighed approximately 80 pounds deflated, required generators to inflate, and had to be anchored against wind. The teams developed techniques for rapid deployment, with well-practiced crews able to inflate and position a complete company of dummy tanks in just a few hours. They also created deception within deception, occasionally leaving one or two dummy vehicles poorly camouflaged, knowing German intelligence would find them, and in doing so, become more confident that the other positions they observed were genuine. The sonic element positioned their speakers to project sounds consistent with two divisions conducting routine operations. They played recordings of vehicle maintenance, troop formations moving, supply operations, all scheduled to match what German listening posts would expect to hear at different times of day. The sound operators understood German intelligence would be listening specifically for anomalies, so they included the kinds of mistakes and irregularities that characterized real military operations: occasional vehicle backfires, slightly off-tempo marching, the acoustic chaos of large-scale military logistics. Perfection would have seemed suspicious. Controlled imperfection enhanced credibility. The radio deception teams transmitted hundreds of messages daily, replicating the communication patterns of two division headquarters and their subordinate units. This required maintaining fictional order of battle information, creating personalities for fake radio operators, and ensuring message content remained consistent with supposed unit activities. They coordinated with the visual and sonic teams to ensure radio transmissions matched what German intelligence could observe or hear. If the sonic team was playing sounds of tank maintenance, the radio operators would transmit logistics messages about parts requisitions and maintenance schedules. Critically, they also implemented what they called special effects, elaborate theatrical performances in nearby towns. Ghost Army soldiers wearing the distinctive patches of the divisions they were simulating visited bars and restaurants, discussing their unit's supposed activities loud enough for German agents to overhear. They staged arguments about whether their division would be moving north or south, carefully scripted disagreements that suggested specific operational plans. Some posed as military police, checking identification of soldiers and asking questions that implied certain units were present in areas where only Ghost Army personnel actually existed. The operation succeeded spectacularly. German intelligence identified two American divisions in positions where only the Ghost Army's 100 men actually operated. Wehrmacht commanders kept substantial forces positioned opposite these fake divisions, forces that could have been committed against the actual Rhine crossings. Post-war analysis of captured German intelligence reports showed German commanders had planned artillery strikes and potential counterattacks against the fake positions, completely deceived by the Ghost Army's coordinated deception. What made this work? The Ghost Army's solution rested on understanding that military intelligence gathering creates a constructed reality built from multiple information sources. German intelligence officers would analyze aerial photographs showing tanks and artillery, listen to radio intercepts discussing unit activities, receive reports from listening posts hearing vehicle sounds, and gather intelligence from agents reporting seeing soldiers with specific unit insignia. Each information source independently confirmed the others, creating a comprehensive picture that German commanders had no reason to doubt because every intelligence channel told the same story. The Ghost Army also understood they were exploiting cognitive biases inherent in how humans process information. Military intelligence operates under extreme time pressure. Commanders need information quickly to make operational decisions. This pressure encourages analysts to confirm existing beliefs rather than rigorously questioning data. If aerial photos showed tanks, if radio intercepts matched expected communication patterns, and if human intelligence confirmed visible unit insignia, intelligence analysts would synthesize this information into a conclusion about enemy dispositions without necessarily resorting to extensive verification procedures that would delay reporting. Another crucial element of their solution involved understanding the importance of living the deception completely, not just staging it superficially. Ghost Army soldiers didn't just wear fake unit patches, they studied the actual histories of the units they impersonated, learning where those units had fought, who commanded them, what their reputations were among other American forces. When posing as members of these units in towns near the front, they could answer questions about their supposed unit's history, discuss battles they'd participated in, maintain the deception even under casual scrutiny. This attention to detail extended to the smallest elements. They aged new equipment to look worn from combat use. They created fake unit newspapers with authentic-seeming articles and announcements. They even maintained fake personnel rosters and administrative paperwork consistent with genuine military units, understanding that if German agents somehow captured these documents, they would provide additional confirmation of the deception. The Ghost Army also developed solutions to one of their most dangerous challenges: what to do if German forces attacked their positions. They established rapid withdrawal procedures, including pre-planned escape routes and signals that would trigger immediate evacuation. They positioned genuine combat units nearby that could respond quickly if the Ghost Army came under attack. They maintained constant intelligence about German capabilities opposite their positions, preparing to abort operations if German forces appeared to be massing for assault. This required accepting that sometimes they would have to abandon deceptions prematurely, compromising the operation to preserve the unit. The solution to making the impossible appear real lay in understanding that reality itself is largely perceptual. German commanders didn't experience American divisions directly. They experienced reports, photographs, intercepted communications, and observations, which their minds synthesized into beliefs about Allied dispositions. The Ghost Army didn't need to create actual divisions. They needed to create the information streams that would lead German intelligence to conclude divisions were present. Once they understood this distinction, the path forward became clear. Control the information, control the conclusion. Beyond the technical solutions, the Ghost Army developed organizational approaches that enabled their success. They created rapid feedback loops where operators in the field could report what was working and what wasn't, allowing the unit to refine techniques continuously. They established quality control procedures where teams would critique each other's work, identifying details that could compromise deceptions. They maintained detailed after-action reports documenting every operation, building an institutional knowledge base that made each subsequent operation more effective than the last. The Ghost Army also pioneered solutions to the challenge of maintaining morale in a unit that operated under extraordinary stress with limited recognition. Because their operations were classified, they couldn't receive public acknowledgement for their successes. Because they didn't engage in conventional combat, other soldiers often viewed them with suspicion or contempt. The unit's officers addressed this by creating internal recognition systems, acknowledging successful deceptions within the unit, even if the outside world couldn't know about them. They emphasized the lives saved by their operations, making clear that every successful deception meant fewer American casualties elsewhere. They also developed what we might call professional pride in craft. These men took satisfaction in the technical excellence of their work, in creating deceptions so convincing that trained intelligence professionals couldn't detect them. The artists among them viewed each operation as a creative challenge, an opportunity to exercise their skills in service of a vital mission. The sound engineers competed to create ever more realistic acoustic environments. The radio operators took pride in maintaining fictitious personalities so consistently that German intelligence officers came to recognize and track these non-existent radio operators across multiple operations. The integration of multiple deception methods into seamless operations required solutions to complex coordination challenges. Visual, sonic, and radio teams had to work together despite different technical requirements and timelines. Visual deception required positioning equipment in specific locations determined by what German observers could see. Sonic deception required speaker placement based on acoustic properties of terrain. Radio deception required transmitter locations that avoided detection by German direction-finding equipment. Reconciling these different requirements into coherent operational plans demanded flexibility, communication, and mutual understanding across specialties. The Ghost Army developed sophisticated planning processes that accounted for all these factors. They created detailed operational timelines specifying exactly when each element of the deception would activate and what it would do. They established communication protocols allowing rapid adjustment when conditions changed. They practiced coordination until it became instinctive, until visual, sonic, and radio teams automatically worked together without requiring extensive direction. Another critical solution involved managing the psychological stress of their mission. Operating within enemy artillery range while maintaining complex deceptions over days or weeks created enormous pressure. The Ghost Army developed stress management techniques, including structured rest rotations, recreational activities during downtime, and psychological support for members struggling with the tension. They recognized that their effectiveness depended on maintaining mental sharpness and emotional stability under conditions that would break conventional soldiers. The Ghost Army also solved logistical challenges unique to their mission. Inflatable equipment required constant maintenance, repair, and replacement. Sound equipment needed electrical power in forward areas where generators were scarce. Radio equipment had to be positioned and repositioned as operations evolved. The unit developed mobile maintenance capabilities, trained personnel in field repairs, and established supply lines for specialized equipment that normal military logistics didn't accommodate. Perhaps most impressively, the Ghost Army developed solutions that allowed them to operate effectively, despite being perpetually outnumbered and outgunned. They couldn't defend their positions if attacked, so they developed escape and evasion plans. They couldn't reveal their mission even to friendly forces, so they developed cover stories and security protocols. They couldn't receive conventional military support, so they became self-sufficient in ways unusual for American military units. These solutions transformed vulnerability into strength by ensuring the Ghost Army could complete missions despite circumstances that would have paralyzed conventional forces. The Ghost Army's operations raised profound questions about the morality and implications of deception warfare that remain relevant today. Was it ethical to win through trickery rather than honest combat? Did the Ghost Army's success suggest something troubling about modern warfare's evolution from direct confrontation toward information manipulation? These questions sparked debates within the military establishment that continued long after the war ended. Traditional military ethics emphasized concepts like honor, courage, and direct confrontation. Warriors throughout history had valued facing the enemy openly, testing themselves in honest combat, winning through superior valor and skill rather than subterfuge. The Ghost Army represented something fundamentally different: victory through illusion, success by making the enemy make mistakes they couldn't recognize until too late. Some officers argued this approach was somehow beneath American dignity, that it transformed warfare into mere theater, where perception mattered more than reality. Critics pointed out that if carried to its logical conclusion, the Ghost Army's approach suggested that the entire battlefield could become a stage, every position potentially fake, every apparent threat possibly illusion. This would force defenders to disperse forces to counter multiple potential threats, making it impossible to concentrate power decisively. Warfare would devolve into an endless game of bluff and counterbluff, where determining truth became nearly impossible. Was this really an improvement over traditional warfare? Did it serve justice when victory came not from superior courage or better soldiers, but from better illusions? These criticisms carried weight worth considering. The Ghost Army's success rested partly on German intelligence officers' assumption that American forces generally fought honestly, that what appeared to be American positions probably were American positions. If deception became commonplace, if every side employed ghost armies, the result wouldn't necessarily be less violent warfare, but more paranoid warfare, where no intelligence could be trusted, where commanders made decisions in fog even thicker than the natural confusion of combat. Yet defenders of the Ghost Army pointed to undeniable facts. Their deceptions demonstrably saved lives, both American and German. Every German soldier killed attacking a Ghost Army position that turned out to be empty was a life wasted on neither side's behalf. Every German division positioned to counter a fake threat was a division not killing real American soldiers elsewhere. The Ghost Army enabled faster Allied advances with fewer casualties than would have occurred if every operation required fighting through determined German resistance. From a purely utilitarian perspective, the mathematics seemed clear. Deception that saved lives was morally preferable to honest combat that spent lives. This raises deeper questions about what we value in warfare. Do we fight wars to test national courage, to demonstrate superior virtue through superior valor, or do we fight wars to achieve strategic objectives as efficiently as possible while minimizing casualties? The Ghost Army represented a thoroughly modern answer to this question. Warfare as problem-solving rather than ritual, as engineering challenge rather than moral test. This perspective treats the enemy not as a worthy opponent deserving honest combat, but as an obstacle to be overcome through whatever means prove effective. Comparing the Ghost Army to historical precedents reveals both continuity and change. Military deception itself wasn't new. The Trojan horse, Hannibal's tactical deceptions, Confederate cavalry creating false impressions of force strength during the Civil War, all represented earlier attempts to win through trickery. What distinguished the Ghost Army was the systematic industrial-scale application of deception integrated into modern combined arms warfare. They weren't using deception opportunistically, but had institutionalized deception, creating dedicated units with specialized equipment whose sole purpose was manufacturing illusions. This represented something genuinely new in military history, deception as a fully developed military capability rather than an occasional expedient. It suggested that future warfare would increasingly incorporate information operations, that controlling the enemy's perception and decision-making might become as important as controlling physical terrain. In this sense, the Ghost Army pioneered approaches that now dominate 21st century military thinking about information warfare, cyber operations, and perception management. Comparing the Ghost Army to other deception operations reveals interesting contrasts. British deception planners tended toward elaborate strategic deceptions. Operation Fortitude, which helped conceal the actual D-Day landing sites, involved creating entirely fictional armies with fake commanders, fictional order of battle, and comprehensive false intelligence. The Ghost Army operated more tactically, creating immediate battlefield deceptions that supported specific operations. Neither approach was inherently superior. They addressed different requirements. But the American preference for practical, tactical deception over elaborate strategic misdirection perhaps reflected broader cultural differences in how Americans and British approached warfare. Soviet deception operations, called maskirovka, employed principles similar to the Ghost Army but on even larger scales, and with different assumptions about acceptable casualties. The Soviets regularly sacrificed units to convince German intelligence that fake positions were real, accepting losses that American commanders would have found unacceptable. This reveals how different value systems shaped different approaches to deception. Americans sought deception that minimized friendly casualties. Soviets were willing to accept higher casualties if deception achieved strategic surprise. The philosophical implications extend beyond military ethics into questions about truth, reality, and knowledge. The Ghost Army succeeded by exploiting the gap between reality and perception, by making German intelligence see things that didn't exist. This raises unsettling questions. If perception can be so thoroughly manipulated, what does this mean for our ability to know truth? If trained intelligence professionals using multiple information-gathering methods could be completely deceived, what confidence can anyone have in their understanding of reality? These questions seem especially relevant in our current era of information warfare, deep fakes, and synthetic media. The Ghost Army operated in an analog world where creating convincing illusions required physical props and coordinated performances. Today's information environment makes perception manipulation far easier and more pervasive. The principles the Ghost Army discovered, that people see what they expect to see, that multiple independent information sources create false confidence, that time pressure encourages confirmation bias, apply even more powerfully to modern information manipulation. Yet there's something profoundly democratic about the Ghost Army's approach. They didn't rely on superior resources or overwhelming force. They won through creativity, through intelligent application of limited resources to achieve outsized effects. In a war where industrial production and manpower often determined outcomes, the Ghost Army demonstrated that intelligence and creativity could multiply force effectiveness. This suggested that smaller powers, resource-constrained forces, and unconventional actors could potentially offset material disadvantages through superior information operations, an insight with both hopeful and troubling implications, depending on who applies it and toward what ends. The long-term consequences of the Ghost Army's success extended beyond World War II. Their operations convinced military planners worldwide that systematic deception deserved permanent institutional support. This led to the establishment of dedicated deception units in numerous militaries, the development of increasingly sophisticated deception technologies, and the integration of deception planning into routine military operations. Whether this represents progress or merely the corruption of warfare into permanent dishonesty remains contested. Some military ethicists argue that the Ghost Army's legacy has been overwhelmingly negative, that by legitimizing deception as a normal military tool, they contributed to an environment where truth becomes increasingly irrelevant, where all information is suspect, where warfare devolves into competing manipulations rather than honest confrontation. Others counter that this criticism romanticizes warfare, that combat has always involved deception, and that the Ghost Army simply systematized what had previously been improvised. The debate ultimately reflects competing visions of warfare's proper role in human society. If warfare is tragedy made necessary by irreconcilable conflicts, then minimizing its human cost through deception seems not just acceptable, but morally imperative. If warfare is a testing ground for national character and individual courage, then deception corrupts this function, making warfare merely another form of industrial problem-solving, stripped of its moral dimension. The Ghost Army forces us to choose between these visions, to decide whether we value lives saved or virtues tested, whether effectiveness or honor matters more when the stakes involve survival. The Ghost Army's experience also raised questions about recognition and remembrance. For decades, these men couldn't discuss their service, couldn't claim credit for their contributions, couldn't even acknowledge what they'd done. This created a peculiar form of veterans' experience, where the most significant events of their lives remained permanently classified. When declassification finally came, many Ghost Army veterans were elderly or deceased, denied recognition during the years when it would have meant most to them. This raises questions about the costs we impose on soldiers who serve in classified operations, about whether national security requirements justify denying recognition to those who serve in shadows. The artistic community's response to the Ghost Army's story has been complex. Some artists celebrate these men as proof that artistic skills have military value, that creativity contributes to national defense. Others feel deeply uncomfortable with art being weaponized, with creative skills employed in service of deception and ultimately violence. This tension reflects broader questions about art's relationship to power, about whether artists should accept military patronage, about the ethics of using aesthetic skills for purposes other than beauty or truth. The Ghost Army conducted its final operation in late March 1945, simulating the presence of the 9th Armored Division, while that unit moved to assault German positions across the Rhine. By this point, they had become extraordinarily proficient at their craft, executing complex deceptions that integrated visual, sonic, radio, and theatrical elements into seamless operations that consistently fooled German intelligence. This final operation succeeded like most that preceded it. German forces positioned opposite the fake American division never realized they were observing illusions until Allied forces had already crossed the Rhine elsewhere and begun their final drive into Germany. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army began the strange process of returning to normal military status. The unit deactivated in September 1945, its members scattering back to civilian life with instructions to never discuss what they had done. The equipment that had fooled the Wehrmacht, the inflatable tanks, the sound trucks, the specialized gear, was stored, classified, and largely forgotten. The Ghost Army's story disappeared into classified archives, known only to the handful of military officers and intelligence personnel cleared to access their operational records. For the veterans, returning to civilian life meant carrying secrets they couldn't share. Bill Blass returned to fashion design, creating elegant dresses and suits without ever mentioning that he'd once painted fake unit insignia to deceive German intelligence. Ellsworth Kelly pursued his artistic vision, developing an abstract visual language that art critics interpreted through various theoretical frameworks, never knowing that Kelly had spent years studying how perception works and how visual information can be manipulated to create false impressions. Art Kane photographed some of the most iconic images in 20th century American culture. His technical mastery of light and composition, informed by years spent making inflatable tanks, appear real in reconnaissance photographs. The contradiction these men lived was profound. They had participated in one of the war's most innovative military operations, had pioneered techniques that would shape modern warfare, had saved thousands of lives through their creativity and courage. Yet they couldn't discuss any of it, couldn't claim credit, couldn't even acknowledge what they'd done. At veterans' gatherings, when men told war stories, Ghost Army veterans remained silent or invented conventional combat experiences to avoid questions about what they'd actually done. They had fought a secret war that remained secret even after the war ended. The decades of silence took their toll. Some Ghost Army veterans struggled with the inability to process their wartime experiences through conversation and shared remembrance, the way other veterans could. They had been trained to deceive, had become experts at lying convincingly, and now they had to continue lying about the most significant experience of their lives. The psychological burden of maintaining classified secrets for decades, while watching others receive recognition for conventional military service, created a unique form of veterans' isolation. Some found indirect ways to process their experiences. Artists incorporated themes of illusion and perception into their post-war work. Sound engineers applied lessons learned creating sonic deceptions to innovative approaches in commercial audio production. Radio operators who had maintained fake personalities for months brought unusual insights to their civilian communication work. But they did all this without ever explicitly connecting their expertise to its wartime origins. The declassification process began in the 1980s, when researchers studying World War II deception operations discovered references to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Gradually, with permission from military authorities, Ghost Army veterans began to tell their stories. Rick Byers' documentary, The Ghost Army, and subsequent books brought the unit's achievements to public attention, finally according these men the recognition they'd been denied for decades. Many were elderly by this time, some had already died, but those who remained alive to see their story told expressed not bitterness about the years of imposed secrecy, but satisfaction that their contributions were finally acknowledged. The public revelation of the Ghost Army's story sparked renewed interest in World War II deception operations more broadly. Historians began examining how extensively both sides had employed deception, discovering that the Ghost Army represented just one element of a much larger Allied deception apparatus. The strategic deception operations that concealed D-Day's actual landing sites, the tactical deceptions that preceded major offensives throughout the European theater, the elaborate ruses employed in the Pacific, all received new attention and appreciation. What the Ghost Army proved remains profoundly relevant. They demonstrated that creativity could be weaponized, that artists could serve as warriors, that winning wars didn't necessarily require more men or better weapons, but could be achieved through superior understanding of how human perception and cognition work. They showed that modern warfare increasingly takes place in the realm of information and psychology, as much as in physical terrain. Every German commander who deployed forces to counter Ghost Army illusions, every intelligence officer who included false information in assessments, every soldier who prepared to attack positions that didn't actually exist, made decisions based on the Ghost Army's carefully constructed perceptions rather than reality. The deeper truth the Ghost Army revealed is that reality itself is constructed through information flows, through the stories we tell ourselves based on the data we observe. German intelligence officers weren't stupid or incompetent. They were highly trained professionals using established intelligence gathering methods that had proven effective. They failed to detect Ghost Army deceptions, not because they were bad at their jobs, but because the Ghost Army understood the methods they would use and crafted illusions specifically designed to exploit the assumptions embedded in those methods. This insight has obvious implications far beyond military operations. In an age where information flows shape everything from political decisions to market movements to individual life choices, understanding how perception can be manipulated becomes crucial. The Ghost Army operated in a relatively simple information environment. Their targets were German intelligence officers using specific known intelligence gathering methods. Today's information environment involves billions of people receiving information through thousands of channels, creating perception manipulation possibilities that dwarf anything the Ghost Army attempted. The principles remain the same. People see what they expect to see. Multiple information sources create false confidence. Time pressure encourages cognitive shortcuts. But the scale and sophistication of potential deception operations have increased exponentially. Yet there's something ultimately hopeful about the Ghost Army's story. These were ordinary men, artists, designers, actors, engineers, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. They discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, created solutions to problems no one had solved before, operated effectively in environments where failure meant death. They weren't superheroes or military geniuses. They were creative people who brought their civilian skills to military problems and discovered that creativity could save lives. The Ghost Army painted illusions overnight that German forces never saw through, created sonic environments that convinced experienced soldiers they were hearing what wasn't there, transmitted radio messages that professional signals intelligence analysts accepted as genuine. They did this not once, but repeatedly, across dozens of operations, in conditions ranging from summer heat to winter snow, under enemy observation, within artillery range, always knowing that if the deception failed, they had limited capacity to defend themselves. They transformed warfare through art, saved thousands of lives through creativity, and spent decades unable to discuss any of it. Their story reminds us that courage takes many forms. The Ghost Army's members weren't the soldiers charging enemy positions or standing their ground under fire, but they displayed a different kind of courage, the willingness to place themselves in extreme danger, not to destroy the enemy, but to deceive him, to operate closest to enemy lines armed primarily with paintbrushes and inflatable tanks, to accept that their greatest victories would be things that didn't happen rather than dramatic actions they could point to with pride. The specific techniques the Ghost Army employed may seem quaint by modern standards. Inflatable tanks have given way to sophisticated electronic decoys, recorded sounds to complex acoustic simulations, false radio traffic to comprehensive cyber deception. But the fundamental insights they developed remain timeless. Perception shapes reality more than reality shapes perception. People believe what confirms their expectations. Multiple independent information sources create false confidence even when all sources are manipulated. Time pressure encourages shortcuts that bypass critical thinking. These principles apply as powerfully today as they did in 1944, perhaps more so given the speed and complexity of modern information environments. In examining the Ghost Army's complete operational record, we find 21 major tactical deceptions conducted between June 1944 and March 1945, spanning from Normandy through France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and into Germany itself. Each operation built on lessons learned from previous deceptions, refining techniques until the Ghost Army achieved near-perfect effectiveness. German intelligence failed to detect any of their major operations, a remarkable record that speaks to both the sophistication of their methods and the vulnerabilities inherent in human perception and cognition. The casualitative impact of their operations extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages. By forcing German commanders to hedge against multiple potential threats, the Ghost Army contributed to a broader degradation of Wehrmacht operational effectiveness. German divisions that should have been concentrated decisively instead found themselves dispersed to counter threats that didn't exist. Artillery that should have been firing on genuine Allied positions instead targeted empty fields. Intelligence resources that should have been identifying actual American intentions instead chased ghosts. This cumulative effect multiplied across the entire European theater. While the Ghost Army directly conducted operations in specific sectors, the knowledge that Americans employed sophisticated deception operations affected German decision-making everywhere. Wehrmacht commanders couldn't trust their intelligence, couldn't be certain what they were observing was real, couldn't commit forces decisively because they feared being deceived. This operational paralysis contributed substantially to Allied victory in Western Europe. In the end, the Ghost Army's legacy extends far beyond the specific operations they conducted or even the lives they saved. They demonstrated that modern warfare requires diverse skills, that artists and creative thinkers can contribute as significantly as conventional warriors, that winning doesn't always mean fighting harder, but sometimes means thinking differently. They pioneered information warfare concepts that now dominate military thinking, showing that controlling the enemy's perception and decision-making could be as important as controlling physical terrain. When we look at contemporary military operations, at cyber warfare, information operations, perception management, strategic communications, we're seeing the Ghost Army's vision realized on a global scale. They understood before most that modern warfare takes place partly in the realm of information and psychology, that perception shapes reality more than reality shapes perception, that the enemy's mind could be as valuable a target as his body. This insight, purchased through hundreds of dangerous nights positioning inflatable tanks and broadcasting sonic deceptions, fundamentally changed how we think about warfare. The Ghost Army's members have largely passed away now, but their example endures. Creativity as a force multiplier, deception as a legitimate military capability, artists as warriors fighting battles that most will never understand. They painted overnight what the Tigers never knew where to shoot, and in doing so they helped win a war and saved countless lives. Their canvas was the battlefield, their audience was the enemy. Their performance was flawless and their reward was to return home and spend decades unable to discuss any of it. but the world is finally learning their story, recognizing that these warriors who never fired a shot in anger were among the most effective soldiers of their generation. They fought with creativity instead of conventional weapons, won through intelligence rather than violence, and proved that sometimes the greatest courage means being willing to stand unarmed in the lion's den, armed only with illusions and the hope that the enemy will believe what he sees. In an age increasingly dominated by information warfare and perception management, the Ghost Army's legacy grows more relevant with each passing year, reminding us that the most powerful weapon has always been the human mind, both as target and as tool for achieving victory. Their story stands as testament to the power of human creativity, the value of unconventional thinking, and the profound truth that in warfare as in life, perception often matters more than reality, and those who control perception ultimately control outcomes.